Well, hello, everyone. This is our third and final talk for the Photowork 34th Annual National Juried Photography Exhibition. My name is Joanna Frang. I'm the Executive Director here at the Barrett Art Center, and I have the pleasure of introducing three amazing photographers tonight who will tell you a little bit about their work. And I am just excited that we're going to stick around. These are locals from New York and New Jersey, and we'll be talking about the works in the show, which are featuring New York, but we're going to hear about all of their work in general. And the show, Photowork, is open until February 20th, and we look forward to seeing you if you're able to come and see us, or you can visit our virtual show online, and we have some installation shots that will be coming up. So I guess tonight we're going to start with Claude Beller, alphabetically, if that's all right, Claude.
That's great. Thank you.
Awesome. And so Claude, please go ahead and take it away.
Share the screen. Yeah.
Yes, please.
Ooh.
Okay. First of all, I want to just thank Joanna, Tricia, and the Barrett Art Center for number one, including one of my works in your show, and number two, for inviting me to speak. It's a real honor. And also congratulations to Ted and Ned for being in the show as well and speaking tonight. It's always nice to see other photographers, and as it turns out, I know Tad. We've studied together. For the show, I'll get right to it. This photograph, which you chose, is called Shoeshine Parlor, and it was shot in Rockefeller Center in the underground passageway that goes between 7th Avenue or 6th Avenue and 5th Avenue. And as it turned out, I was actually not looking to shoot in there, but I always had my camera with me. But I was heading over to St. Patrick's on 5th Avenue because I was doing some stuff in there that I wanted to shoot, and I came across this Shoeshine Parlor, and I stood outside the window and I looked at it and I said, God, this has so many elements in it. At first, it seemed very, very cluttered, but then after I took the shot, I took about 3 or 4 shots until I got the right expressions. But after you look at it, you see that everybody's in their own kind of world. It's a real New York City mix of people. And it just captures that kind of, the essence of a New York population, which is one of the things that I've been gravitating toward in my work. I'm a street photographer. And in this shot, I decided to keep everything in the frame because I thought that even though it's cluttered, everything tells a story. So it isn't just about the people in the subjects, but if you look around on the right side, you see photographs, and many of us know in certain shops you'll see photographs of famous people who sign their photographs. You see all these bags of shoes being waited, for people to pick up, all the different cans and shoe polish and shoelaces, and it just kind of encapsulates a certain energy that goes on because these guys are working constantly. People are coming in and coming out, coming in and coming out, especially in a place like Rockefeller Center, which has so many businesses, buildings around it and in the building. So you can imagine the kind of energy that goes on there. And I felt that when I looked at it, it just had all the right elements. And the more I work in photography, the more I'm more discerning about what I'm looking for. Just as a brief background, most of my career I was a filmmaker, documentary filmmaker, and for 40 years. And about 5 years ago, I stopped doing that. My wife got sick and is disabled, so I had to stay home and take care of her. And I couldn't go on location anymore. And I decided that I needed to do something creative. And I said, why not photography? And it's visual. I'm a visual person. So I got a camera. My first camera was a Fuji X-T1. I'm now on to the 4th one. And the biggest challenge for me as a photographer and starting out was I was so used to movement in filmmaking where you're following the scene. The whole idea of being able to look and just capture and compose in a frame and to say something was a real discipline that I didn't have, and that took a long time for me to develop. So without further ado, I'm going to go on to some other shots. So one of the projects that I worked on, and it was a class project, and I was inspired by Bruce Davison and Gary Winograd and Helen Levitt, the real icons of New York street photography. Was a subway system, and also the Staten Island ferry, which I've always enjoyed taking whenever I want to get out of my place and just see some water. And actually Walker Evans also did a subway series where he hid his camera inside his coat, and he would sit in the subway and just shoot people. But I didn't do that. I just got a small camera. My camera's small, the 23mm lens, and I began to just kind of work myself around to try and get shots without people seeing me. I was looking for people in isolated moments or groups of people, and to capture that kind of a moment in time. So the next photograph is one that actually has gotten a lot of publicity over the last year, and I wanted to share that. It's called Subway Father. Now, let me see, how do I get to it? Okay, here. Now, this is a shot that I took in the subway during the morning rush hour. And I had the camera with me, and I was just right across from this gentleman who had his child. And he just, at a certain moment, he just looked down and had this incredible, loving, tender touch and look and feeling. And right in the background, it says happy hibernation. And you can see the infant, the toddler is sleeping. So I just whipped my camera around. I already had pretty much focused, to that distance, and just snapped it and took the shot. And it's just one of those moments where it all kind of came together. And it's one of my favorite shots, and it's been, shown a number of places. The next one, which I also have liked a lot, is on the Staten Island ferry. And I had just gotten a wide angle lens, and I was walking around the ferry like I normally do. And I came across this scene. And I said, wow, look at everything. Again, sometimes you just kind of come across a shot and you just know that everything is right about it. And it's rare. If I get one a month, I'm happy, or every 2 months. And most photographers will tell you that. The more you shoot, the harder it is to get a shot that you like. And this is one where you can see the light coming in and reflecting off the back of the seat, the woman's leg and the silhouette and the reflection in the floor, the guy in the back whose legs are also crossed but in a different direction, and then the man turning around looking at me. And and the woman had no idea I was taking the shot. And I think the guy he must have, I don't know why he turned around. Normally they don't even look at me. And this is one of those shots that, that I really feel good about and kind of like a lot, and has a lot of the elements that you make a good photograph that I think. And let's see. So now I'm going to move on to some more photography in the subway. This was a great scene where I sat across. This is another example where you sit down in a subway, you never know who you're going to sit across. Just one of those moments. And I said, wow, look at this. The guy on the left got his iPhone. He's got one eye. The one in the middle is doing something that's it's been done for hundreds of years, reading a book and writing. And the one on the right is listening to his music. And they're totally oblivious of each other. And it's a great New York scene. I mean, this is the kind of crowd you might see on the subway, or the people. And there's no connection between any of them. They're all in their own world. And none of them knew I was taking the shot. And here it was. And I was just, wow, this is fun. And it's just one of those things and these are the kinds of things that as a creative person, this is the stuff that I look for, right now, in terms of my work. Another quiet moment, somebody doing something where she could be doing this, and not caring about anybody else, she just getting ready for work and putting the makeup on. Here's somebody who had a rough day, long day, and you see the reflection in the side. And I just felt that this woman really must have worked hard today. She was on her way home. And again, it has, the elements of reflection, of duplicating images. And now this is one where a lot of times I just shoot from the hip. I don't want someone like this looking at me, shooting him, because I can't run away on a subway car. So in the street, I can run away. But I said, nah, I got to get this guy, but I can't aim the camera at him. So I had it on my waist. I kind of figured and it was just an accident that I cut off his head. And then when I showed it to Chris in class, he said, "Oh, that's great composition. Perfect. You cut his head off. That's how it should be." And I said, "Okay." One of those things that I learned after the fact. I never intended to cut his head off. But Chris, this is a little energy silhouette against the side of the car. Rush hour. Pre-pandemic, you wouldn't see this for a while. Another Staten Island ferry, and this is where we learned about layers. If you look at the front layer, the middle, and the back, and that's one of the things that I look for sometimes in these shots. Not on the subway, but when I'm in the street or somewhere else. And so you have something happening in the front here, something happening in the middle section, and then in the back. And that's on the ferry. I'm moving along. Oh, this is one of my favorite shots. This guy, to me, epitomizes pandemic. It says everything. I mean, his eyes, the way he's isolated. There's no one else around because very few people were taking the subway at that time. This is, and he just looks so despondent. And, I don't know where he's going off to work someplace, or he's an essential worker. And I felt it kind of really characterized the situation. And also, this is an example in the creative sense where I was lucky that another train was in the background there, as opposed to just poles. So that always gives you another layer, and it's soft, which is what you want to do, so that the focus goes on to the subject. Now, this is a series I've been working on for a little while now, called Solitude, and I'm finding people who are by themselves. And this man comes every day to the park. This is a Teddy Roosevelt Park by the Museum of Natural History. And he has this expression. You can see the curve of his hat, curve of his eyes, the curve of his mouth, and the curve of his hands. They're very parallel. And that's something that we want to look for in a photograph, is to find these connections of forms, here's another person in the Central Park in early morning, just who knows what his story is, just gazing off, oblivious. I was right next to him. I took about 4 shots. He had no idea I was there. And you can see he's deep in thought, and the light was very nice in the morning coming on him and his hair. This is a St. Patrick's shot, another person by themselves, just praying. Soft focus in the front, soft focus in the back, and just highlighting the subject. And I thought, even though there are people around, it's still a very solitary moment. Another person kind of down and out. Here we have an interesting shot of a woman holding her dog as if it's her baby, in the way she's, the sense of her hands holding it, the love and the tenderness as well. And the dog looking off to one side and her to the other side. And, people in New York and their pets, it's very, very connected. I have 2 dogs, so I know what it feels like. Another one, this is more of a formal shot where you look for, I saw him sitting there early in the morning. Well, not early, but you can see that you have curves of the backs of the chairs. In the window, you have the shadow of a person on the right side, and he's just sitting there. And, and again, one of the things that you look for is vantage point, where you shoot from, what angle. And so you can move around. In this case, I did move around because he was also caught up in his own world. This is another strange person. What can I tell you about him? Interesting. But if you look at the circles of his eyes, of the nipples, of the circles on the bench, they all work together. And these are the kind of things that, I learned, in class. This is one of the values of going to a photography class, is that being fairly only 5 years into it, this is the kind of stuff I would never think about. And here's a woman, by herself. Who knows what her story is. Now here's a shot of 3 people on Broadway. Even though there are 3 of them, each one is in their own world, and then you have this deep center that kind of brings it, and your eye goes there, but each one of them is a character in their own right. And they, and the one guy in the middle is looking at me, but he didn't seem to mind. Okay, now this is my recent work. I just been shot this a couple of weeks during the snowstorm, and I'm starting to do a little more work in color. And I just want to show a few shots of that, and then my 15 minutes will be up. So this is a shot during the snowstorm where I saw this guy walking down the street. And originally, and this is what I learned, and when Tad was talking about processing, all these colors of the car were much deeper red, deeper blue, deeper black. And I just pulled them all back to a much subtler color. I left the color there, but I wanted the focus to go to the guy in the center, just kind of black. And then I also lightened the tree in the back so it wouldn't interfere. And that's a kind of a thing that you can do in post-production. And nowadays in Lightroom and Photoshop, these are fairly straightforward techniques. So that's one color. This is fun. Dog walkers in New York. There were 18 dogs. So I got down and got them all. I didn't get all 18, but it's kind of a fun shot. You look at, if you're a dog lover, it's great. I actually cropped the people's heads off, the walkers. I think the dogs are much more important than the walkers. Let's see. Oh, this is interesting, working again in color. You can see the connection between this gentleman, his lapels, his shoes, and the stripe on the street. And I never thought like this until I started studying photography, that this is great. It pulls it all together. Not only see a character, but the colors. And what I did here, so I'm working a little more in color, although I still prefer black and white. Another color shot that I was walking by and just happened to see this, and I said, that's very mysterious, kind of a little erotic, and different things happening. If you look through you can see the wheel in this circle here, the rear view mirror. There's always, I waited for another car to come by in the background, so it would have something to, I would be back there. It's kind of mysterious in a way, and I love the red. It's a beautiful color. I think I might have one more here. Oh, this is a shot I just took last week, and it's very upsetting. At first I'm seeing this woman, and I know she typically, the women, they go to construction sites and they dig out, they sell food to the workers, which are in the big coolers. And then I said, oh my God, there's a kid in the bottom. And that brought up all kinds of feelings about, cages. We heard about separation. And I got, it just brought all those images back of these children who have been separated or are caged. And I feel, and this is daycare. This is somebody who can't afford daycare or can't afford to send their kid anywhere. So what else do you do? And so I think that's the last one. So that's my presentation of my work to date. A couple of my projects, the subway, Solitude, and working a little in color. And I think 20 minutes, I think that's it, right?
Well, yeah, thank you so much for this really over these 3 bodies of work that you've showed us today. And for better or worse, these are iconic New York, like this is, it says New York. And one thing to I noticed is that the second group called Solitude, those people were alone in some way, and as were even on the subway, all those people were as
Yeah.
alone. And I wonder what happens when that moment gets broken and when people realize you're there, and how do you navigate that? You know, when do you
Well,
talk
I've
to
had,
people?
yeah, it's hard. I've never asked anybody if I could take their photograph. I think it loses the spontaneity of the moment. And so I don't do portrait work for that reason, you know, where I ask, you know, there are a lot of people do environmental portraits but a lot of the time they don't, you know, they don't care. Some people said, don't take my shot, and I respect that if they see me with the camera. Some people said, if you take my shot, I'm going to break the camera over your head. You know, I've had that a number of times. So, but I'll tell you, most of the time when I take these shots, the ones that you saw today, very few people knew that I was taking it. You do it very quickly, and you just kind of get the shot, shoot it, a lot of times, which is an old technique, you move the camera around as if you're shooting something else, you know, and then the person thinks, oh, he's shooting the people across from me. And then when they look down, you just go right over to them and take the shot. So there are different techniques, and a lot of the time, you know, and then there are times I just miss it. You know, things happen so quickly. I just said, oh God, I wish I had I would have been faster, but you know, I'm happy with what I get, and I'm grateful that I'm able to do this in my life right now. I'm 76, and you know, I didn't know I would be doing this, you know, and you know, I was a real filmmaker, love making films, and now I've got this passion for photography. I just wish someone would buy me a Leica Q2M monochrome for $6,000.
Dear Santa.
That's, you guys know what that is, right? That's incredible. That would be my dream.
Yeah, I think what's also stood out is the way when you were talking about this, how slowing down and taking the one image, and how photography has just changed how you see the world.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's just brilliant, and the way that we talk about photography for this exhibition and why it's still so moving. You know, we still see something new in the photographs we see every year. So I really want to thank you for sharing that.
Well, thank you, and I really appreciate the opportunity to do this. I'm not often asked to speak, so I'm really enjoying this.
Well, thank you. And so from you, we'll move to Tad, who is going to speak. He's actually a little local for us. He's from the Hudson Valley, but his photographs range from all over the world. So I will let Tad go ahead and take over the show.
Okay, so let's see, share screen. I'm hoping this is going to work. Do you see the image of the drive-in movie?
Not yet.
Oh boy, and I even practiced this. Let me see. Let me try the share button.
There you go.
Okay.
Oh, now we've got everything. So
okay. Now I'll, there we go. There we go. So now you see the drive-in?
Perfect. You got it. Take it away.
Okay, great. So this is my third time participating in Photowork, and I'm very happy to be in it again. And I want to thank Joanna and the Barrett Art Center team for organizing these great shows and for their contribution to the Hudson Valley art scene. So in this show, I have two images, and one I took before COVID and one I took after. So I thought I would spend my time evenly between what was I doing before COVID, what have I been doing since. So before COVID, my main interest was street photography. In fact, I had a couple of classes with Claude at the International Center for Photography doing street photography. And it was fun for me to see his more recent work. But in the time of COVID, I've been spending less time in New York City, less time in crowded areas, and more time trying to avoid people in my car looking for architectural and design themed things. So this one, which is in the show, is the Overlook Drive-In in Barrett. I'm sorry, near Barrett. And I did it in black and white primarily to be able to use the green filter in Lightroom, because there's so much grass and trees that by darkening them with the green filter, it made the poles and the screen pop out, which were the main design elements. And this one's also near Barrett. It's the former Kmart. In fact, you can just see the hint of it on the sign. So I wound up watching the other presentations as part of this series. And one gentleman had a picture of an empty billboard in the desert in the Middle East and said that a lot of his recent work has revolved around emptiness. And it occurred to me that some of mine has been too. So, so I have a house in Hyde Park, which is right next to Poughkeepsie. And one of the most prominent things on the border of Hyde Park and Poughkeepsie is this Hudson River State Hospital. In fact, you can see their initials in the circle on the top of the building. And it's now been purchased by a group that's going to build some shopping and some housing. And they started clearing the land. And so more of the 1870s portion of the complex started to be revealed. And then they started demolishing some of the 1950s. So pretty much every day for 6 months, I went by this site and took pictures of the various buildings and stages of demolition. So this was the large 1950s era building, which is being demolished. And I was frankly fascinated by the machines that did it. They're like T-Rexes, and they ate the building piece by piece, pulling I-beams out, pulling bricks out. I thought this was such a big building, it would be a Las Vegas type explosion and leveling it. But, so for a period of months, the building shrank. And the graffiti on the top, evac and toast, could be seen for miles down Route 9. So I don't know evac and toast, but they had quite a gig going for about 20 years, but now it's gone. So this is the main building after one of the wings had been removed, and I came by late in the afternoon to get the sun, and you could sort of see all the little rooms, the treatment rooms, and all the different colors of them. So that was kind of fascinating to me.
It's great.
And this one is almost like you're taking an X-ray of the building. So they had torn the building down to just one level thick. So I kind of liked looking through the windows. And then this is sort of before the building disappeared. So again, sort of late afternoon, sun warming it up. And I think a week or two later, it was just gone.
Wow, that's great.
So now this is very recent, like Claude showed his recent work. My wife Pam and I were in Florida for the month of January. And at the house we rented, one windy day, the lawn furniture blew into the pool. And I'm thinking, oh, this is pretty annoying. Let me go get it. And then I'm looking at it thinking, no, let me get my camera. Have an aqua chair floating inside of a aqua pool. So, and you can see the ripples of the wind on the surface. And I started doing more night photography, and in this case with flash. So there was somebody selling 1960s and 70s muscle cars on Route 1, and the flash to me made the headlights look like you had come into the jungle and found a tiger that was thinking about pouncing on you. And this one is maybe classic Florida. You have the smoothie stand, the palm trees, and a pawn shop. So sometimes I was going out at like 5:30 or 6 in the morning, as with the case of this next one. This is downtown West Palm Beach, and I had passed this mural earlier and really liked it. And I thought, let me come back at night. And I sort of like the buildings, with the occasional apartment lit up. Maybe somebody's getting up, and I think the little patches of blue here and there, contrasting with the warm yellow streetlight helped out the composition. So this one is also in the show. And so this is from my pre-COVID period. And so it's in Times Square. That woman sells hats and she puts them on top of these mannequins. So I've been taking a lot of mannequin pictures, thinking of making a series out of it. So I asked for permission to take pictures of her mannequins. And she said, "How about this?" And she held it up. I wish I would have had either the imagination or the nerve to ask her to do it. And she just said, "How about this?" And I said, yes. I took the picture and was delighted with the result. So this one, another, like, I guess things, I find some of my best pictures are unexpected. Like, I didn't go out planning to shoot this. I was actually on my way to B&H Photo on the far west side of Manhattan. And I noticed people on the subway wearing crazy outfits. It turns out it was Comic-Con. And I thought, okay, well, I didn't really plan on shooting this kind of stuff, but let me hang around the neighborhood and see if I can take pictures of people in unusual costumes doing normal things like checking their cell phones. So I think I rode up and down this escalator 20 times, getting princesses from Star Wars and all sorts of different characters. And so also a big haunt of mine is Washington Square Park in Greenwich Village. And there's plenty of poets and plenty of philosophers. So sometimes I think with this guy holding the sign, like the New Yorker has all these cartoons of somebody sitting on a ledge high in the mountains and somebody crawls and crawls and crawls to come ask him what's the meaning of life. I think if you got to the ledge, this is the guy who would be sitting there. Also, the woman has a shirt with a lot going on, and the Latin phrase means know thyself. So now, this was one of my favorite pre-COVID experiences. I'm a member of Photographers Without Borders, and I did 2 assignments for them, one in India and one in Madagascar. And I almost certainly would have done another 1 or 2 by now if I'd had the chance. So this one was taken in Maheshwar, India, for a group called Women Weave, and that's a women's textile cooperative. And Photographers Without Borders sends you to places to work with the not-for-profit to take photos that they can use for their website, for marketing, for selling their product, wherever that may be. And so in this case, I was documenting the women doing their work. And notice the technology here. It's basically a repurposed bicycle, and she's spinning the threads that will later go onto the loom. This woman is winding the threads onto bobbins using this wooden contraption. And by the way, they had a very good daycare center, and her child decided to sit with her while she was working, even though there was a whole big playroom. So here is the row of fibers through which the spindle passes. This woman is repairing a break in one of the threads. And you can faintly see underneath, there's another layer of fibers. So the spindle passes back and forth between those. And the women use both hands and both feet in the process. So the pedals go up and down, and that opens and closes the 2 sets of threads so the spindle can go between them. And then here's a woman using both hands. So the wood bar you pull toward yourself and it tightens the thread that just passed with the other one. And the knob in her right hand, you move it left, you move it right, that makes the spindle go left and right. So it makes kind of a clackety, 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 clack. And they had, I don't know, maybe 70 or 80 of these machines. And their mantra is from farm to fiber. They basically do everything. I mean, they weave the threads, they dye them, they spin them, they turn them into fabric. So really an impressive group. So at the end of my stay, they asked if I would do some fashion shoots, which I had never done before, but I thought it would be a fun idea. So they gave me some magazines to look at, some textile catalogs, and they were all fine. And I did some of the things like draping the fabric down a staircase and having it hanging off the back of the boat, blowing in the wind and that kind of thing. But then I said, in the US, there's this ad for Jack Daniels, where they have the guys in Tennessee who make the whiskey and they're making the barrels, they're stoking the fire that does the mash. And I said, why don't we have some of the weavers model the fabrics, and nothing else will say handmade better. And these are the people who made it. So they liked the idea. And every day for a week, we got two of these little tuk-tuks, like tricycles, and one with me and a couple of models, and one filled with textiles, and went down to the river and posed in different ways. And at first it was hard to get people to model. And then by the end, there was a big clamor to participate. And by the way, the models were compensated with the amount they would have made weaving. So it was a fair deal for them. And being a street photographer, well, this town actually has more paths than streets. So I walked along the river every day, going to and from my hotel to Women Weave's headquarters. And in this case, these are worshipers. I asked their permission. And I learned a trick from a book by Jay Micel I read. And so he said, like, when he doesn't speak the language, he points to the camera, points to them, and nods his head and waits to see if they nod their head. So having zero Hindi, I did that. This gentleman nodded, and they stopped and posed for me. So that was one of my favorite street kind of shots. So my other assignment was a group called Empower Men, and they're based in Madagascar. So like with Women Weave, their mantra or their mission is gender equality, but they go about it in an interesting way. They do training sessions for boys and young men to teach them positive masculinity and to teach them to respect women's rights. So unfortunately, their society, like a lot of them, the adults have, gotten out of that habit, but they're working with the kids, trying to train them right from the beginning. And they do a lot of group exercises, like this one was the "What is a Man?" And so they're going to draw cars and other stuff that a man would have. Also, about half the photos I took do not show people's faces, because these are kids in a farm-based reform school, and so they want to be able to use some of these things in their websites for what their program is like. So I took some with faces and some without. And everywhere we went, which was schools and other organizations, we always had a responsible party sign a release that we could use any photos we took, either me or Empower Men or Photographers Without Borders, but clearly there's sensitivity to this kind of thing. So this was at the biggest high school in Antananarivo, which is their capital. The guy holding the microphone is the founder of Empower Men, and most of their leaders are in their 20s, and they're very engaging and articulate people. And I would say impressive to me is their first language is Malagasy. Their second language is French, because it's a former French colony. Their third language is English, and they speak about as well in English as I do. So pretty amazing people. And you can see the reception that they're getting. And you can also see everybody wears a uniform, and the girls are on the left side of the room and the boys are on the right. Now, this last couple of slides, this was from a school for the deaf. And that woman is doing a sign to explain what the message is there. So she's pointing to a muscle-built guy on a motorcycle, kind of saying, like, that doesn't have to be the model for men. I mean, it's, you don't have to be strong or muscle-bound, or there's different models for being successful as a man. And so that was well received. In fact, what's going on here is, being deaf, they're applauding, but they're doing it almost like the Queen of England. They rotate their wrists left and right. And these kids were so incredibly adorable. And then my last one is a street photography shot. So this was sort of the central park of the capital. And I saw these workmen disassembling a ride to move it. And they noticed me taking their picture, and they started walking. So I started following them, and they started walking faster. And finally they ran and I ran. So we all had a big laugh at the end, and then they posed for me doing handstands on the rides and things like that. So I think that is it for me. And, again, it's been a pleasure doing this.
Wow, thank you, Ted. You have taken us around the world, literally, and from Poughkeepsie to start with. I just wondering how you think about your street photographer head to your or your vision, actually, how you see the world. Street photographer to working as a contracting with these nonprofits, to kind of documenting the for example the hospital. Do you put on a different hat, or is it just a different lens of seeing, or do you think it's all the same thing?
Yeah, well, they're all part of the same thread. And it's interesting because for Photographers Without Borders, their tagline is storytellers for change. So I think, like, what is the story here? And maybe this is, Claude's background as a documentary maker. So I'm trying to think, what am I trying to say here? Why am I here? Why is this interesting? What do I want to accentuate? What do I want to get rid of? So whether it's a building or a group of people or some fabrics, the mindset's kind of the same. And then it also carries over to processing, where you can accent colors or lights that you want and hide other things you don't want by like painting over shadows. And so I know, like, a lot of people have like the thing they do. And I think in the other presentations I've seen, like, here's what I do, and here's the last 21s of it I did. And here there's everything from drive-in movie theaters in Poughkeepsie to fabric makers in Maheshwar, India. So pretty hard to, and demolition of a hospital in Poughkeepsie. So what the heck is all this? But it gets me driving around, thinking, framing things visually. The subject matter is always different. At some point I'll find something where I go, this is really it, and I'm going to stick with it. But for now, I'm just enjoying the world and seeing it with the photographer's eyes.
Absolutely, that photo of the pool with the chair in it, where you had to stop from being you and go back to the photographer eyes, made you take a second look. So I really appreciate that. So if you want to unshare your screen, we'll head up to Ned, who's going to tell us a little bit about his New York scene.
Oh, nice.
And as soon as, yep, we'll just unmute Ned.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. What a pleasure to be here, and such a joy to be part of this exhibition. And I so appreciate also an opportunity to talk about my work at the Barrett, and also to be on the same platform with two such fine photographers, Tad and Claude. Really wonderful stuff. So this is a picture that I took in Grand Central Terminal a while back. It's part of a much larger body of work that I actually did. It's actually my MFA thesis. I was in graduate school at the New Hampshire Institute of Art, where I received an MFA. And I did a lot of work in photographing people in Grand Central. But so I want to talk about sort of three things quickly here. I'll talk about kind of how this work came about. And then I'll talk about what I thought of it when I was doing it. And then I want to talk a little bit about what I think about it now, because I think one of the things that the pandemic has done, among many things, is really changed my thinking about photography. So this work in Grand Central didn't begin this way. It really began this way. I was shooting in Grand Central, and I was interested in a particular idea, and that idea was the idea of people going to various and sundry places and getting lost. And I love this idea of, the kind of courage it takes to get from one place to another and to try something new, and to sometimes suddenly discover that, You need directions in terms of how you get to a place. And there's no better place to do that than in the sort of info kiosk in the middle of Grand Central, which is sort of iconic. It's that big thing with the clock on top. But there's this stream of people that, you know, are constantly going there, and they need information about what train to take or which subway to take and that sort of thing. And so essentially, that's sort of how I got interested in photography in Grand Central. And I took this work off to graduate school with me. And everybody knows, who's ever been to art school, knows what happens in your first semester in art school. You know, you get sort of totally hammered. And this work got totally hammered. It wasn't, I think the reception actually wasn't that negative, but people told me something I think was very true, which is that it's very kind of constrained and narrow. It's always about this single narrative. You know, I don't know where I'm going, help me find out where I'm going, right? And people have different reactions to that. Sometimes they're very relieved, sometimes they are upset, sometimes they're irritated, and sometimes they're stressed. But in each case, the sort of the basic conception of the photograph is sort of constrained by that narrative. And you know, one of my professors, a wonderful photographer named Yoav Horesh, told me, he said, you know, I can look at 5 of these and I'm just done. It's sort of like a dessert that has too much of the same flavor in it, right? And so I went away and started to sort of think about this. And one of the things you do, or should do, when you're kind of stumped as a photographer is look at the work of other photographers that have sort of impressed you. And so I went back and I looked at some work of photographers that I really like. One is David Heath, who's not very well known actually, but was a wonderful photographer out of Philadelphia in the 60s and 70s, really fine street photographer. The Philadelphia Museum did a show of his work, a retrospective on his work in 2015, and it just sort of blew me away. So I went back and looked at some of that work, and then I looked at the work of Travis Huggett, who I actually sort of encountered on Tumblr. He's a Brooklyn-based photographer who did a wonderful book called Last Night at the Bus Stop. And what Huggett did was, he lives in Brooklyn, I think, and he would take his camera and set it up next to a bus stop, literally at night in Brooklyn. And when the bus would pull up, he would photograph people through the windows of the bus, illuminated by the interior of the bus. And I found this work really inspiring because of the way, first of all, because of the light in the bus, which is kind of perfect. And the way, in fact, these sort of got framed as portraits. So you had street photography, but you also had a kind of portraiture going on. And then, of course, I looked at this guy, whom a lot of you will probably remember or recognize if you follow photography much. This is Phillip Lorca de Corsia, who did a series of photographs called Heads. This was around 2000. This is fabulous work. What de Corsia did was he set up a camera sort of off to the side in Times Square, I think at night. And then he put a big strobe up, arranged to get a big strobe put up in some scaffolding, and then puts a piece of tape on the ground. And then when people would walk across the tape, he was far enough away so he couldn't really tell exactly what he's shooting. But when people would walk across the tape, he would just fire the shutter, and the strobe up and the lights would kind of explode. And you'd get this amazing light, right? And these amazing sort of portraits. Now, it's interesting that, you know, de Corsia does a lot of street photography that he stages, but this was not staged. I mean, these folks didn't really even know they were being photographed, but the photographs themselves were kind of beautiful. And so I said to myself, well, you know, I'm just going to go back to Grand Central Terminal, which I did for about 2 years, about once a week. And I'm just going to photograph people. And that's what I'm going to do. And what really drove that, to some extent, this is my work now, was a sense of how the light worked in that building. Because in Grand Central, you have this kind of natural light combined with a little bit of artificial light. And that light only shows up at certain times of the day. Anytime you're photographing, if you're a natural photographer like me, and you're photographing like in your house or in a building, you're basically turning that building into a kind of Stonehenge. So basically the light isn't going to be the same in the same place all the time, right? It's going to be, the sun does not set and rise at exactly the same place Otherwise, we'd all freeze to death because of the tilt of the Earth. So you get this amazing light in Grand Central, but you have to kind of figure out when it's going to show up there. And I just began to photograph people, essentially in this kind of great light. And what I started to develop was a sort of street photography that's really a kind of portraiture. And, you know, I would just sort of do this. Oops, sorry. Let me go back. I would do this sort of all the time. And I found myself sort of wondering, while I was doing this work, what it was really about. And, you know, I will make a confession to you. I like to shoot first and think about what I'm doing later. I'm not a very good planner in terms of my own photography, but since I was in graduate school, I sort of had to figure out a way to talk about this work. And one of my mentors, a guy named Mark Ludak, is a wonderful photographer. You know, he told me, Ned, you don't have to worry about anything. He said, all you have to do is just tell people this work is about light and you'll be fine. But the problem is, you can't exactly go back to graduate school and tell people your work is about light. So I had to kind of think about how to talk about this work. And the way I think I persuaded myself that this work was fundamentally about, and I think this was true, is it really is kind of about light. It's about the democratization of light. It's about the fact that every individual can be a kind of heroic figure in their own portrait in a certain kind of light. It doesn't matter who you are. It doesn't matter where you come from. And if you go to a place like Grand Central in that particular beautiful golden light, you know, you're going to look great no matter who you are. And there are actually two, I mean, there were two inspirations for this. One, of course, is Walt Whitman. This is a very Whitman-esque idea. You know, the great sort of equality of American democracy. And Whitman himself wrote in a poem, but I paint myriads of heads, but paint no head without its nimbus of gold-colored light. And that became kind of the motto for my project. I said to myself, I photograph nobody without, no head without its nimbus of gold-colored light. And the other thing that sort of inspired me was actually something that Emmett Gowan wrote. And I had seen his work about 2 years ago at the Pace Gallery in New York City. He had somehow persuaded some years ago the Energy Department to let him photograph the Nevada test site. The Nevada test site is out in Nevada where they blew up about 250 nuclear bombs. That's where they tested nuclear bombs. And it's this landscape that's, you know, in Nevada that looks like the moon. It's all pockmarked with these sort of places where they did underground explosions. And in that book, he wrote an essay in that book, and it wasn't so much about the Nevada test site. It was about essentially he had flown over. He had an experience where he had flown over the plutonium processing plant in Hanford, Washington, and he'd noticed the sort of sun coming out. And he wrote this. He said, "This was perhaps one of the most poisoned landscapes on Earth, and yet, in a sudden burst of sunlight and what seemed unjustified luminosity, a transcendent light settled over the landscape. I felt then I was learning an unexpected lesson. Our deeper human problems are not the domain of light. Not only does the sun not care about our wishes, but the living presence and beauty of a glorious and luminous light has no enemies. Our shortcomings forgotten, we are all for a moment its children." And even though I know he was talking about, you know, the sun coming out over a plutonium plant, processing plant, I sort of realized when I read that that's kind of what I was trying to experiment with. And so, you know, with that in mind, I just kept shooting for about 2 years, once, twice a week. I had to figure out a way to figure out when the sun was actually going to be there, because it isn't always in the right place at the right time. So I had to learn about things like the zenith angle of the sun and the azimuth of the sun, which are the two parameters that sort of tell you where the sun is going to be in the sky. Because what happens in Grand Central is it's surrounded by skyscrapers. So what the sun does is it bounces off various buildings and then blasts into the building, almost like a kind of laser at times. And in order to figure out when that's gonna, it doesn't happen every day. It doesn't happen every season. So you have to kind of figure out where the sun is going to be in the sky before you shoot there. Strangely enough, because I never use flash or strobe, and so I just kept photographing there until about February of 2020. This was my last shoot actually in Grand Central. I was kind of wrapping up this project for so I could do my senior my senior thesis exhibition, which of course got sort of canceled. But this was about 9 days before the first case of COVID was reported in New York. And we know now, of course, that since that time, there've been about 1.5 million cases of COVID in New York City, and about I think something like 45,000 deaths. And I realized as I began to process this work in the ensuing months that I had to think about it quite differently. That all of that talk about light not having any enemies and the democratization of light and all of that good stuff was fine. And it was true when I thought it was true, but it simply didn't apply to this work anymore. This work had become profoundly elegiac, and it also had become documentary. I never thought of it as documentary photography. I was actually moving kind of away from street photography. I don't think you would think of this as street photography in a conventional sense. I think you would think of it almost as a kind of portraiture that goes on without getting people's permission to create portraits of them. But I think at some point it became documentary in the sense that all of a sudden I realized that I was photographing, the end of a kind of way of life, where people get on the train and they go to work, where people don't wear masks, where people congregate in buildings and crowd together in buildings, where people take chances and risks by moving around, even though they don't know exactly where they're going. I realized all of a sudden that life was not available anymore. It was as if I'd become a sort of Bazai guy, the French photographer Bazai, who basically was, documenting pre-World War II life in Paris, right? Before the Germans came. All of a sudden it hit me that this work was kind of working in that way. Now I don't know, I don't want to go too much into French theory here, but maybe one of the most important books, and it's slender, which is good if you're reading French theory, but it's one of the most important books on photography, I think, probably ever written is one of the most famous, is Barthes Caramel Lucida. And he wrote this shortly after his mother had died. He lived with his mother for about 40 years. And in that book, he sort of got this idea exactly right. I think he said, photography is prophecy in reverse, like Cassandra, but eyes fixed on the past. And what he meant was that when you look at a photograph of your father that you took 20 years ago, you know everything that happened to him in that intervening 20 years. If you knew it when that photograph was taken, you would be a prophet, right? You would be a Cassandra. But it's like Cassandra in reverse. You know all those things that happened, even though you sort of didn't know them when that photograph was taken, right? And Barthes writes, in front of the photograph of my mother as a child, I tell myself, she's going to die. I shudder over a catastrophe that has already occurred. Whether or not the subject is already dead, every photograph is this catastrophe. Now, I wouldn't go quite that far. That seems very French to me. But I do think there's an element of truth in that. And one of the things that the pandemic has certainly taught me, among many, many things, and this is certainly not the most important one, but it has made me very skeptical about interpretations of any photograph. It's made me very skeptical about how I interpret my own work, because I've realized that not only what the pandemic has shown us is how fragile our own life is, and how fragile our own way of life is. But it shows me how fragile a photograph is in terms of what we think of it and how we think about it and how we interpret it. That's certainly something that I've learned. And I think going forward, I'm very dubious about trying to explain my work to people, because I have a feeling that the world is going to explain it for me in some sense, you know, in ways that are much more complex than I can do. So that's where this work came from. Thank you very much.
Wow, thank you, Ned. I wasn't expecting you to kind of end at that that conclusion with the theory that was in there, and kind of thinking about these works as social texts. At the same time that you're clearly very interested in technique and knowing about the angle of the sun and how it's going to work in the space. And I guess my initial thought was to kind of think about how you see those two things working together, but maybe you don't see those things anymore as linked.
I do see them as linked. I think that part of it is interesting, because one of the things I do a lot of landscape photography, and one of the things I sort of realized in doing the Grand Central work was that it really doesn't matter that you're indoors. I mean, if you're shooting essentially with natural light, whether it's your kitchen or a corner in your kitchen or Grand Central Terminal, you're really connected with the natural world in ways that you probably don't even realize, or you need to realize if you're using that light. But I think what a lot of us don't realize is that even when we're inside of buildings, we are much more connected to the sort of diurnal rounds of the sun and the earth and the fall and the changing light than sometimes I think we realize. I mean, the amazing thing about Grand Central is it's kind of a deconstructed Stonehenge. It really is. You can not only tell what time of day it is by where the shadows are cast, but you can tell what time of year it is. If you were somehow locked in that building, you could probably figure out by where the light strikes, whether it's, whether you're in the fall or whether you're in the summer or whether you're in the spring. And in that sense, I find that very powerful for me in terms of kind of my own work and how I go about doing it. I really do not like flash. I don't like strobes. I really like to kind of work with the light that's available to me. I think Tad's nighttime photography, and I think Claude's too, those guys are using light in really interesting ways. I mean, they're using natural light in really interesting ways. And kind of what I mean by natural light is simply to make use of what is available to you in terms of the photograph you take. I think that's the kinds of things you're going to do to respond to that light is what's going to make the photograph really, really interesting. I saw a lot of that in Claude's work. I mean, a lot of shadows, a lot of I can never say that word. Carry, I can't say it. Sorry, but I think you know the way. A lot of contrast and shadow in that work, and I think that's sort of the kind of work I'd like to do. But I like to do it that way because I'm reminded of the fact that light is this natural thing, and that it's kind of your obligation as a photographer to figure out how to use what is given to you in that regard.
Very nice. So with that, if you want to unshare your screen, and if the three of you want to respond to each other in any way, I think you all could probably be very well suited to sit around at dinner together for 4 or 5 hours and talk about photography. But if you just, Ned, spoke to the different ways that your works kind of resonated or were in dialogue with each other. If Claude or Tad, if you guys have anything you want to add to that.
Yeah, I have one comment, which is interesting. In Ned's presentation, he mentioned that he doesn't get permission, and he showed the landmark photograph from Lorca de Corsia that established that you don't need permission.
Yes.
So the photograph he showed was of a rabbi, and Lorca de Corsia printed it and showed it in a gallery.
Yeah.
And one of the rabbi's friends saw it and told him, hey, you're in a big picture of you in a gallery in Soho. He went down and saw it and sued Lorca de Corsia and said, how dare you take my picture walking down the streets of New York City? So the court case established that you have no right to privacy in the public areas of New York and that photographers may take your picture.
Yeah.
So basically the three people you have here today are all street photographers in some sense. And that very picture is what established our right to take pictures of people in public. So private's another thing, but public, if you're in a public area, you can be photographed.
Well, there are a couple of issues there. Well, you're absolutely right. One issue is that I think you're absolutely right. You're absolutely within your rights to take a photograph of someone if they are in a public space in which there is no reasonable expectation of privacy. And that you're absolutely right about that photograph. That really established that street photography can be done legally, because it's not always legal in every country. And even some free societies, there are constraints on what you can do. The other issue, I think, is that there is this limitation, which is you cannot use the photograph commercially, which doesn't mean you can't sell it or hang it on a wall or put it in a gallery, but you cannot use it for the purposes of advertising, which means you cannot use it on the cover of a book. So if you publish, a book of photographs in Grand Central Terminal, you cannot put, one of those photographs, at least if they contain people, on the cover of the book, because that's deemed to be advertising. The third thing I'd point out is that I hope that holds, but that case was never appealed. So it's case law, basically.
Yeah.
But it has never been upheld by the Supreme Court. So it's a precedent that could someday be overturned. I hope it.
What's interesting, in my very first class at ICP, they talked about the rights of street photographers and actually gave you the page in New York City law that says you are allowed to take pictures of people in public areas. And they suggested we carry it around with us. Yeah. So for a while, I would go to like Central Park, Washington Square Park, and then if somebody had a problem, I'd say, but according to New York City law, and then it's like, I think they're going to punch me in the face. They don't care about New York City.
I have it written.
I'm never going to bring up the law. I'm never going to bring out this piece of paper. If somebody looks like they don't want me photographing them, I'll
I've carried that around with me in my wallet. I've never showed it to anybody.
Yeah, well, I tried it once with one of those guys playing chess near the public library.
Not worth it getting
into
it.
Like, you better. I'm gonna take that piece of paper and shove it down your throat. Out of here.
Ned, one of the great Grand Central photography photographs is the Bernice Abbott one.
Yes.
Grand Central.
Yes.
And you don't have to deal now with the people smoking cigarettes, which then, that's what caused all that beautiful light that came in from both sides of Grand Central, because it was all smoke in there and that reflected on the light. So that's not an issue for you anymore, because you can't smoke in there.
But the light is quite amazing. You'll see a lot. Well, there are a lot of photographers in Grand Central, and you'll see and a lot of wedding photographers, of course, in Grand Central, and they have that light absolutely down, because there are certain times of day when you have to, if you're going to shoot in Grand Central, there are a couple of things you have to, particularly if you have to get up at 5 in the morning like me to get there, right? There are a couple of things you need to check to save yourself some time. One is no clouds. So you have to check the cloud forecast, and you have to kind of know where the sun's going to be relatively in the sky. But
I never.
But it's a particular time of day, usually in the morning, where you get this amazing laser-like light. And on those days you'll see a lot. There are just a lot of wedding photographers that will show up and basically photograph people at light, because it's better than any strobe you could sort of invent. But I miss it. I have not been back since February. I know it was empty. It emptied out by March, of course, when we went into lockdown. I think more people are back. I've seen photographs. People have sent me photographs of activity in Grand Central, and you guys may know better than I do.
I went to the New Moynihan station the other day, and the light just floods through those skylights.
Oh, right. Yes, I'm looking
for
for
the old post office. Yeah, you only it's very even.
Right.
It comes right through. Lots of shadows.
Yeah.
In any case, I'm gonna have to run now soon.
Yeah, well, thank you all, and for the way that all of you have captured the light in your work. And I really hope that people get a chance to see this in person, but I also understand that it's available online to take a look at. And I look forward to hearing more about what you do with your work moving forward, all three of you, and hope you stay in touch. And thank you everyone for watching. Photowork will be up until February 20th, and a copy of this will be up on our YouTube channel very shortly. So we look forward to seeing people again soon for our next show, which is Represent, which is actually about portraiture. So we'll have another go around at this. So thanks very much, guys.